So for the last segment in this chapter, we're going to now take a look at a case of implementing export subsidies, but instead of this competitive market scenario that we've really been talking about up to this point, we're going to look at a case where we have an imperfectly competitive market. And specifically, we'll look at a case where you have two producers, in other words, a duopoly. And we're going to use this pretty famous example here, a widely used example of Airbus and Boeing. Why do we use this industry as an example? Well, for one thing, when you're looking at commercial aircraft, Boeing and Airbus are the two dominant players in the entire world. So this is just a great case for us to look at. You don't find too many markets where you have two or three relatively small number of firms dominating the global market. But that is the case here for commercial aircraft. So we're going to use a little bit of game theory in order to analyze how a country, or in this case a set of countries, the EU, might possibly use an export subsidy to try to get economic gains. The key thing here is that because we have this duopoly, if you can get your national champion, your national company there, and by national I don't mean public, I just mean like for the US it's Boeing and for the EU it's Airbus. If you can get your company to be the one that's dominating the market, that's in there producing, then your company will capture all of the rents. And then of course you could tax those rents and end up with higher welfare for your region. So let's put up a simple game. So we're going to have Airbus is going to represent, right, they're going to be up here representing the columns are going to be their two choices. And their choices are to produce or to not produce. And then we're going to have Boeing over here, and they're going to represent, they're going to be the rows here. And so again, you've got produce, right, and not produce. So what we're drawing up here is what we call the payoff matrix. In order to put together our payoff matrix, what we have to do is represent all of the possible choices for our actors here, our economic agents. So what we have here is a 2-by-2 matrix because we have two players. We have Boeing and Airbus, and each player has two possible courses of action, produce or not produce. So that gives us 4 total different outcomes. So in other words, what we have is if we're up in this quadrant here, this is the scenario where both Boeing and Airbus produce. Okay? And so in this case, let's say, so this is when they're both going and competing head-to-head, that in this case, the payoffs are going to be minus $5 million to each. Okay? So we're going to put Boeing's payoff on the bottom half of our square here, and Airbus's payoff is going to be in the upper half, right, or the upper triangle of this square. So in the case where they both produce, compete head-to-head, both firms are going to lose $5 million. Now in the case where Airbus produces and Boeing does not, Airbus captures the whole market, and in that case, they end up with plus $100 million. And all of our numbers here are in dollar terms. In Airbus, because they're staying out of it, their payoff is 0. They've stayed out of the market. Now we're going to make this game symmetric in the sense that we're just going to flip the payoffs, right? So when Airbus stays out, right? So in the right column, those are the two scenarios where Airbus does not produce. So in the upper right is the case where Airbus does not produce, but Boeing does. In that case, Airbus gets 0 for its payoff, and Boeing is going to get the $100 million for its payoff or its positive economic profit. And in the case where they both stay out, well, in that case, both of them just get 0. If neither company produces, so that's Boeing doesn't produce, Airbus doesn't produce. In that case, their profits from both cases, right, the rents are going to be zero. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look for our Nash equilibrium or Nash equilibria, because in a game you could have multiple equilibria. So what is a Nash equilibrium? Well, a Nash equilibrium is a stable outcome, right? So we have four possible different equilibria here, right? These are the four different outcomes. Any one of these could potentially be an equilibrium. But what does it mean to be in a Nash equilibrium? That means that if you start in that or you end up in that scenario, none of the players have any incentive to unilaterally move away from that outcome. So let's go ahead and take a look. How would we go and go about finding our Nash equilibrium? So let's start from Airbus's perspective. And the way you want to work through these payoff matrices is you say, okay, look, if Boeing produces, right, so we're working with the upper half of our payoff matrix here, these two outcomes. If Boeing produces, what does Airbus want to do? Well, in that case, 0 is better than losing 5 million, so Airbus would choose not to produce, right? So if you knew that Boeing was going to produce, Airbus would want to stay out of the market. On the other hand, what if Boeing does not produce? Well, in that case, Airbus would rather capture the market and take the 100 million in economic profits over 0. So its best response when Boeing doesn't produce is for Airbus to produce. Notice I use the term best response. Right? That's what we're showing in each of these cases. We're showing Airbus's best response given the action chosen by Boeing. Now we're going to do the same thing for Boeing. If Airbus chooses to produce, then Boeing's best response is to not produce, to stay out of the market and have 0 rather than a loss of 5 million. Okay. If Airbus does not produce, then Boeing wants to produce and capture the market, get 100 million in profit instead of 0. We've actually now identified two possible Nash equilibria. Right? The case where Boeing doesn't produce and Airbus does is one Nash equilibrium, and the outcome where Airbus does not produce but Boeing does is also a Nash equilibrium. So the question, of course, is, well, which one would we end up with? Well, it could depend on a lot of things. Let's say, for example, that Boeing gets a first mover advantage. If Boeing gets to decide what to do first, then Boeing is going to enter the market because it knows that once it chooses to enter the market and produce, and if they can commit to producing, that's going to keep Airbus out. Okay. The question that, let's say, like the EU might have is, well, how do we end up not in this Nash equilibrium? How do we end up here where Airbus is producing? That's what we want. We want our company to be the one to get the 100 million in profits. So here we think about changing the payoffs. Okay, so draw another payoff matrix here. So again, Airbus, Boeing, produce, not produce. So we're not going to affect Boeing's payoffs at all here. We'll keep those all the same. But what we're going to do is we're going to change Airbus's payoffs by having the EU government give a subsidy of 20 million, or 25 million rather, okay? So what we're going to have is a $25 million subsidy to Airbus if it produces. Okay? So it's going to get this subsidy of $25 million if it produces. And so what does that do to our payoff matrix? Well, now we change this to a scenario, right, where instead of losing $5 million, right, so it'll lose in the direct competition $5 million, but Airbus is going to get $25 million from the EU, from the governments of the EU countries, and so that'll actually raise its payoff to plus 20. Okay? And in this case, right, where its payoff was 100 million, that just goes up now to 125. If it doesn't produce, well, that still stays at, it's going to stay at 0. Okay. So let's go through and analyze our payoff matrix in our game again and see what would happen. Start off with, well, let's start with Boeing this time because we know we haven't changed any of their payoffs, right? We know that, look, if Airbus produces, Boeing is going to not produce. Okay. If Airbus doesn't produce, Boeing is going to want to produce. We haven't changed Boeing's best response in either case here. But what about for Airbus? Well, in the case where Boeing produces, Airbus now wants to produce because with the subsidy, it's going to gain 20 million as opposed to nothing if it stays out of the market. And if Boeing doesn't produce, well, in that case, Airbus really wants to produce because it's going to get the 100 million profit plus the 25 million in subsidy. So now here, what we're showing is that Airbus has what we call a dominant strategy, and that is to produce. A dominant strategy is one that you want to play regardless of what your opponent, what the other player or other players, if we had more than a two-player game here, do. And so that's what we found here. Right? It doesn't matter what Boeing does, whether Boeing produces or doesn't produce, Airbus always wants to produce. Okay? And if Boeing recognizes that this is in fact the new reality, then Boeing's going to stay out of the market because it knows it can't win, and we will end up with our sole Nash equilibrium down here. Now, what does that mean from a welfare perspective for the EU? Well, with a $25 million subsidy, you've guaranteed a payoff of 125. So they could actually come in, offer a production subsidy of 25 million, and then after the fact, go ahead and tax Airbus and get the whole subsidy and perhaps even a bit more back. Okay? So this ends up being a net welfare gain to Airbus and to the EU in general. Now, there are some problems with this basic analysis. For one thing, how does the EU government know what the payoffs are going to be? Right? Does Airbus have an incentive to misrepresent the payoffs and maybe mislead the government in order to try to get that subsidy? Does the EU government know Boeing's payoffs? So let's look at an alternative situation where Boeing actually has a cost advantage. Okay? So we'll draw one more payoff matrix here. All right, produce, not produce. And again, the same choices for Boeing. Produce or not produce. Okay. So now we're going to change our payoffs. We're going to continue to have the subsidy in place for Airbus. Okay, so we're going to keep the plus 20, 0, 0, and plus 125 million for Airbus. I'm going to keep those payoffs the same as with this scenario here. But now we're going to change things so that in the case where they compete head-to-head, Boeing still makes a small positive profit. Okay. And in the case where Boeing actually produces all on its own, captures the market, it gets large profits of 125 million. Okay. So now we have, right, taking this scenario with the subsidy, but adding in a cost advantage for Boeing. So what's this going to look like here? Well, for Airbus, we can see once again that they still have this dominant strategy. Right? If Boeing doesn't produce, Airbus definitely wants to produce and capture the market and get the 125 million. If Boeing doesn't produce, if Boeing does produce, they still want to produce and get the 20 million net payoff that they get with the subsidy from the EU. So again, Airbus has a dominant strategy to produce with the subsidy. What about Boeing in this case? Well, in this case, when Airbus doesn't produce, in this right-hand column, for sure Boeing wants to produce. We haven't changed that best response, right? They want to capture the market. But what about when Airbus does produce? Even when they compete head-to-head, Boeing ends up earning $5 million in economic profit as opposed to 0. So now we see that Boeing also has a dominant strategy to produce. So in this case, our sole Nash equilibrium is the case where they both produce. So you might look at that and say, well, hey, that's not so bad. For Airbus, they get a plus 20 million. But how do they get the plus 20 million? That comes with the $25 million subsidy. Right? So the plus 20 million in producer surplus minus the cost of the subsidy gives a net loss to the EU of 5 million. Okay? So why did it work in this case? In this case, the subsidy worked to create a welfare gain for the EU, for the European Union area, because it knocked Boeing out of the market. But in this case, the subsidy isn't enough to knock Boeing out of the market, so it doesn't end up giving Airbus the whole market. It doesn't give them a monopoly in the end. So that's just one of the problems with trying to implement a strategic subsidy like this. Of course, even if you are in a scenario like this one, what would make you think that the U.S. wouldn't respond in kind and retaliate? Why would they just let their national champion get knocked out by the EU's subsidies? They could also respond with subsidies of their own, in which case they would counter Airbus's subsidy. So you just end up going back to a scenario like this, except you'd guarantee that both produce, but both might be producing at a loss and only staying in the market because of subsidies. We'll take a look at this and some other more complicated scenarios in class. It's important to recognize anytime you're using these kinds of games to look at how you might use, in this case, a export subsidy to sort of game the system to make sure that your side wins, you always have to think about how the other side is going to respond to that.